Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Abramson. I'm a senior fellow at the Arms Control Association. I also manage a project called the Forum on the Arms Trade, which is a network of experts around the world who work on arms trade, security assistance, and weapons use issues. I'm super delighted to have you all here. I'm super delighted to have this panel. This idea came together when Omar contacted me. He's been doing some work looking at the arms trade in the Middle East, and we decided, hey, why don't we try to do something in the Middle East? Here in DC, looking at this topic broadly, not just the arms trade, but many other things. Was delighted that some of the forum experts, such as Jody, agreed to be on the panel, and Linda agreed to moderate. It's about all I'm going to say. I'm going to turn it over to Linda, who's going to help quick introductions to the panel and get us started. We really want to make this a great chance to learn. When we were planning this meeting, we sat about what do we want to talk about, and I was just enthralled as we were thinking about all the different topics that could come up. So I think we're in for a really lively discussion. We definitely want to have time for Q&A at the end. So thank you very much for being here, and let me turn it over to Linda.
Thank you, Jeff. I've actually got a mic. And I remind my panelists to turn on their mics as well. I'm grateful to Stimson and to Forum on Arms Trade for hosting us and sponsoring this event. And from my case, I was kind of minding my own business when I got tapped for this, and I'm delighted because I actually get to be introduced to these fantastic panelists, and I'm looking forward to their remarks. And I may jump in a little bit because I was involved in the American Bar Association proxy war report that's on the table that I hope you have a chance to look and take with you to review. It's not unrelated to the topics we're talking about today. I just want to give very brief introductions to our panelists in the order in which they'll make their remarks, and then hand them over, let them make their remarks. But I'll point out that there is a bio sheet over on the table as well, if you have a chance to get it and you want to delve more deeply into their backgrounds. Let me start with Jody Vittori, who will start our panel off. She is an expert on exactly what we need expertise in right now: corruption. That's on everyone's minds. State fragility and illicit finance. She has a background with the U.S. military and the Air Force, and has been to many of the places that we can talk about, and I'm looking forward to her remarks. Second, we will hear from Samar Aboud, who has a fantastic title. He is a professor of global interdisciplinary studies. I want that job. That sounds so cool. I bet it is at Villanova. And he's extremely active and has a lot of expertise and has done a lot of work on Syria. So can really bring some details home for us on that. And then thirdly, Omar Dahi will round out our panel at the end. And he's holds dual appointments at University of Massachusetts Amherst and associate professor of economics at Hampshire College. Clearly has done a lot of really relevant thinking on these issues, and again, looking forward to hearing what Omar has to say. I will give them 12 minutes before I get obnoxious, and hope that we can really save much time for your involvement. This is a great kind of intimate room and space, and we can make it very conversational once the panelists have made their remarks. So without any more ado, I'll turn to Jody.
Thank you so much. I can be taught. Old military person who wore combat boots. You got to talk, short, choppy sentences, etc. with me. I'm delighted to be here today. Thank you to the Stimson Center. Thank you to the Forum on Arms Trade. So I work for Transparency International's Defense and Security Program. Most people are familiar with Transparency International and its specific country work, but we have certain thematic programs as well, and our oldest and largest one, which is actually based out of the United Kingdom, is where we look overall at the linkages of corruption, defense and security, and international peace. And so I run the U.S. office on that. And I'm delighted to be here because we have recently launched 2 reports that I just want to highlight some of the key issues today as it specifically relates to the Middle East and the role of U.S. defense exports and peace and security in that region, or the lack of peace and security in that region, which pictures may indicate behind. I can't see them very well, but I'm pretty sure that's what they're about. So thanks to the funding of the Carnegie Corporation, we started with some interesting puzzles to understand defense exports. For those, taking a step back in time, we've had a lot of talk in the last couple months about post-Watergate hearings, church committee hearings, and so forth in 1975. And believe it or not, when we talk about the kind of hearings that went into the creation of things like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, Corruption related to defense exports was a major issue involved in the formation of issues like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. It might seem a long time ago, but the situation was they're doing these series of church committee hearings that come out. They're talking about all sorts of illicit activities going on when it comes to politics in the United States. And lo and behold, some of the key individuals giving testimony are the CEO of Lockheed Martin and other defense firms, who are very open and very happy to be talking about the types of bribes and corruption and so forth that they do quite readily. And these had real foreign policy, national security ramifications for the United States. So for example, Lockheed Martin was discussing the kind of bribes that they gave for defense, to get defense purchases from Japan. And lo and behold, the Japanese people weren't too thrilled to find out that their defense purchases were made in large degree because of bribes, and the Japanese government ends up falling. This is kind of a concern to us in the United States for foreign policy issues. Japan is a major ally in the 1970s. There was also testimony, for example, how Lockheed Martin would provide bribes to governments in Latin America to get them to buy American defense goods instead of funding things like schools and hospitals and so forth. And they were very open about this testimony, and the reason they were open about this testimony is because it wasn't illegal. It was business practice as it was. Everybody knows the famous stories about, bribes being able to be written off your taxes and so forth. So part of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that goes through, as well as a whole lot of other defense export related laws and rules, are either updated or created in the wake of Watergate and in the wake of Vietnam War and in the wake of all these congressional hearings and journalistic exposés and so forth, to better get a control on U.S. arms exports going around the world. And so we have the Arms Export Control Act, we have amendments to the Foreign Assistance Act and so forth, to try to get control over how defense exports go through. There was a recognition of the role that defense exports had played, for example, in pushing the United States into wars in Southeast Asia that we really didn't want to be getting involved in at the time, again, that were against UN foreign policy goals. Fast forwarding to 2019, when we're putting the report together, and we have this issue now of defense exports going to countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE that one could argue are not in the U.S.'s best interest from a foreign policy perspective. And so we wanted to understand, for example, how does one get $8 billion in defense exports through to Saudi Arabia, UAE, Jordan, places that rank either an E or an F on our government's defense integrity index. We rank ministries of defense on their susceptibility to corruption on a scale from A to F. Being that it's the Brits that do it, there's a score E in there somehow. But anyway, no country in the Middle East and North Africa scores particularly well on that. Most of them are in the E or F range, which means that there's a lack of parliamentary oversight. There's a lack of publication or transparency on defense budgets, on defense procurements, on reporting, on what the population knows. There's a lack of knowledge on who gets the contracts, whether these contracts can be steered, for example, to the Minister of Defense or members of his family, those sorts of things. Defense offset contracts, which are these sweetener contracts that go with large defense exports, that can often be worth as much as the contract itself, at least in theory. So we wanted to better understand that. So we ended up taking a look, based on the substantial literature that's out there on both the U.S. military-industrial complex literature, which has not been substantially updated since the early 1990s, and also on some of the work on how lobbying and industry influence works when it comes to the Congress and to the federal bureaucracy. And I would refer you to a report, but I see actually they're gone. But I encourage you to go to ti-defense.org and pull them up. But really taking a look at how it is that these defense exports continue to go through into countries with terrible human rights records, lack of democracy, lack of oversight, poor scores often on the Corruption Perceptions Index, poor scores on the Defense Governance Integrity Index, and yet companies find that they don't have a whole lot of significant impediments to exporting to these particular countries. The U.S. actually does have one of the better defense export systems and oversight mechanisms, but the ultimate export mechanism is for Congress to ultimately vote down particular exports, and that ever since the law has been passed has never actually successfully occurred. Twice it's gotten very close, once regarding Saudi Arabia and then more recently in 2019. but it has never actually occurred. So we wanted to understand that better. So we took a role at this interlocking collective action problem, looking at the role of lobbying, campaign finance, the revolving door for contracts, defense offsets, and what we called soft influence. So your think tanks, your membership on defense boards, and then of course being Transparency International, what we do best, which is old-fashioned corruption. To better understand how do those exports go through, the complex interactions. It's not just the principal agent problem of defense company gives, through intermediaries like lobbyists, give money to the executive branch or to members of Congress and they get the legislation they want. It's a much more complex system of that, in part because you also have governments involved. In our case, we were looking specifically at the Middle East, so you've got Middle East governments involved, and they're doing all the same sorts of things that defense industry is often doing. They're doing, sometimes illegally, campaign finance and lobbying. They may be offering revolving door jobs or sitting on boards. They may be putting money through think tanks. There was a series of computer links on some of the money that think tanks have been making on defense industry things. So all of these interactions. And then we have the federal bureaucracy, the defense bureaucracy. And defense is really interesting in this situation and unique in that over 50% of U.S. discretionary spending now is on the Department of Defense. And it's rising. This becomes a big issue, particularly as budgets will become more constrained due to lack of tax base. But the U.S. Defense Department, so separate from Medicaid, Medicare, that's non-discretionary spending. It is over 50% of discretionary spending in the United States now. It is a massive, massive budget, and that means that they have, every other agency basically in the U.S. is a rounding error when it comes to the U.S. Defense discretionary budget. And that means that they have particular pull, both the pull with the defense industry itself, but also pull to a large extent with the congressional executive level bureaucracy. If for no other reason, as a former veteran myself, no one wants to make the troops mad, no one wants to make veterans mad. There's been a lot of discussion about the lack of oversight, often by Congress, of the Department of Defense, because many members in Congress don't feel comfortable calling the Defense Department onto the carpet. A lot of this has been reflected in things like the lack of a new authorization for the use of military force, the fact that it took, I think, 18 years for the Department of Defense to finally get audited after they were ordered to do so. All of these sort of interactions that involved in there. And the reason we focus on it is because of the role in international security itself. Just to give some examples, the U.S. Institutes of Peace did a big report on combating violent extremism in 2019. And they said what many of us academics had known for a long time, which is that violent Islamist extremist movements are larger and in more countries now than they were in prior to 9/11. And they put some, not all, but some of the blame on U.S. security assistance, which includes arms exports, when we do that. And this is particularly an issue because I think a lot of times, and having sat in these meetings myself as former military, we sit across from the table with governments and we assume that the governments may have the national security of the country at heart, rather than looking at the role of the regime at heart. Security is ultimately about providing the ability to use violence to protect a particular regime. And if that regime that you're protecting is a democratic regime governed by rule of law and open markets or, some sort of market forces, et cetera, personal freedoms, human rights, et cetera, that is a very worthwhile goal in a regime to be providing aid and protection to. But if you have a regime that is a very authoritarian and corrupt regime and whose goal is to maintain that authoritarian and corrupt regime, if they're a highly predatory regime, then security assistance and arms exports and so forth are highly likely to increase the capacity of that regime to be authoritarian and corrupt and predatory. And often there aren't the substantial necessary checks to provide that oversight. And there's even fewer checks oftentimes depending on the types of defense exports. If they're direct commercial exports and so forth, there are checks on things like agents and so forth, or people on watch lists and so on. But sort of that larger strategic thought of what is this actually going to do to the regime? Is it going to help push a regime towards a more democratic one? Is it going to push it towards a more human rights oriented one? Or is it going to reinforce the current authoritarian regime? Is often not taken at a strategic level. And that has led us to some of our policy recommendations overall. One is that there be a requirement for oversight of we would ideally say an agency, as a stopgap measure, at least someone on the National Security Council, whose job it is to specifically look at defense exports and make sure those are aligned with larger U.S. foreign policy interests as a subset of security assistance. And also that State Department and Defense Departments, as part of doing their defense exports and security assistance overall, require better transparency, accountability, and good governance, training and capacity building, and actual implementation within those governments that are receiving it, not as an afterthought, but as a primary goal and actually a first requirement before going in. Also reestablishing the State Department as a lead agency for all security-related assistance, and that includes defense exports. Defense Department has a big role and should, but more an advisory level. Ultimately, foreign policy should be with the State Department. Increasingly, because of the way the U.S. munitions list and arms export regulations and conventional arms trade regulations are going, more and more has been moved to Department of Commerce, which has far fewer checks on it. We would like to see that move back into the State Department. Part of the legislation, the Arms Export Control Act, there we go, was this recognition that exporting arms is different than exporting tractors or sweatshirts or something when it comes to U.S. national security and U.S. national interests. We need to bring that back into that role, and recognizing that exporting arms or other lethal or sometimes even non-lethal munitions are different than normal market forces and need to be treated as such, and need to be treated as an important part of U.S. national security. And then finally, we put a number of recommendations in for decreasing just the overall influence, lobbying, and revolving door, more transparency and accountability in revolving doors, requiring military officers, like I was at one point, to have revolving door exit plans published that can be tracked so that people aren't working in areas that they've previously had oversight of. Right now, the rules of what actually you can't work in is very, very narrow, so increasing those areas. And limiting things like campaign contributions and stuff from the defense sector for national security purposes. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Somewhere. He's going to go at the end. Yeah.
Is that okay? Can everyone? Thank you, everyone. I was hoping Omar was going to go after Jody because that was a great presentation. Thank you, Jody. I thought, whew, I have a few minutes to gather myself. Thank you, Jeff, very much for putting this together. Thank you, Linda, for agreeing to moderate. Omar and Jody as well. This has been a really interesting experience for me to kind of think through some of these ideas, and especially in relation to this question of the relationship between industry and violence. I think that's a very, very interesting topic for us to think about that I'm actually not going to talk too much about this afternoon in my remarks. I want to begin my remarks by acknowledging the immense challenges that we face in making sense of U.S. policy in the region right now. I think we all have to acknowledge how difficult it is to untangle the United States from the conflicts that are happening in the region, but also to begin to kind of identify and understand specific patterns of policy and intervention, especially as it relates to the question of how it impacts people in the region. This challenge of thinking about the U.S.'s role is aggravated by the reality of other forms of non-U.S. intervention into the Middle East. So here I'm thinking of regional militias, I'm thinking of regional states, I'm also thinking of international financial institutions and the like. So what we're looking at today in the region, especially after post 9/11 period, the post uprisings period, is a region that is being intervened upon by violent and non-violent actors that are affecting the lives of people throughout. So in the brief time that I have today, with this in mind, I want to make two general comments about how I understand the materialization of U.S. policy in the region today, through my own experience and understanding of what's happening in Syria. So I want to read these experiences of the U.S. intervention in Syria and make some general comments about U.S. foreign policy in general. And my intention is to raise more questions than I answer. The first point I want to make relates to this image that we all see here. Has anyone seen this image in the last few days? So the first image is, or the first concern that I have, the first comment I want to make, is on the implications of deepening U.S. involvement in the region. What we see here is a U.S. Army vehicle stuck in the mud at a Russian and Syrian regime checkpoint. Now, in the events leading up to this, there was a confrontation between the convoy in which a Syrian civilian was killed. Syrian civilians had confronted the convoy, and then it was trying to get through, and it was waiting for permission from the Russian and regime forces on the ground. It gets stuck in the mud, and you can imagine all the craziness that happens here. For me, what we're witnessing today in the region is the expression of planetary and perpetual warfare that's driven by new technologies of war on the one hand, and the increasing presence of U.S. soldiers in the region on the other. At the same time, we're witnessing, for me, a kind of the emergence of new geographies of conflict that are outside. I think Jodi's point is an excellent one about current developments being outside of political oversight. So the one example that I would point to is maybe the base structure report. The last one, I think, was 2018, that details kind of where American bases are, the costs, and so on. And there are all these bases around the world that we know exist, such as the ones in Syria, that are not accounted for in the base structure report, that we don't know where the money's coming from. I mean, I'm not entirely sure. Maybe Jodi can help us. No, we don't. So in places like Syria and Niger, I think that there are these patterns that are emerging in which the American military presence in these countries becomes a launching pad for regional war, for regional violence, whether it's through drones, whether it's through the presence of soldiers like this. And this is really not just, I think, stretching U.S. forces, which I know very little about, but what it's doing is expanding the geography of violence. It's expanding the geography in which U.S. forces are enacting violence in the region, specifically in the Middle East, but also, of course, in parts of Africa. There's language that's used about strategic flexibility, regional posture, this kind of language that I'm hearing a lot of that I think reflects how the American military presence is no longer national in many of these countries, but is very much regional. So the fight against ISIS, for example, can be coordinated through a network of bases in Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere. And we are seeing this, of course, with the interventions in Iraq, I mean, the assassination of Soleimani, and much of the American presence in the region now is coordinated through these networks of bases. So beyond enhancing American military reach, beyond changing geographies of conflicts, I think that this pattern is entangling the U.S. and the region's conflicts in ways that we don't quite understand or appreciate. So I would use this as one example of a way in which U.S. forces are simply becoming more and more entangled. Another example is the presence of the American military base in the tri-border area where Syria, Jordan, and Iraq meet. And that base, based on an agreement with the Russian forces in Syria, has been kind of turned into a de-confliction zone or a de-escalation zone. But in the process of doing that and preventing any civilian, humanitarian, or military people into that region has actually entrapped camp. And there are tens of thousands of refugees who are living in this camp that people cannot access. It's very difficult for them to get out. Of course, they have to pay the militias to get them in and out. And it's these kind of patterns that the United States is becoming more and more entangled in. The second comment that I want to make, of course it's related to the first, is that these entanglements are connected to patterns of kind of threat making, of securitization. And I'm not sure what the coherency is of this threat making at this point. And in the process of creating threat around the region, it makes desecuritization, that is like removing something as a threat, makes it much more difficult. And I think we're seeing this brutal cycle emerge over and over again, where the construction of a threat demands further militarization, that then produces more threat, that demands further militarization, and so on and so on. So one minor example of this that I'm thinking of is the aftermath of the assassination of Soleimani. The US response was to send more troops to the region. When many people were thinking, we don't need more violence, we don't need more presence, that the response is actually to send more troops. Another example might be the President Trump's protect the oil strategy, which I have in my notes as being very silly, and I stick to that. So this idea that when we decide to, or when the United States forces decide to withdraw from the Northeast, that somehow there has to be an assertion of this, a continued assertion of the presence, so we're going to protect the oil. And it's these sorts of things that I think reinforce the need to have an American militarized presence in the region. The unwillingness of the administration to withdraw troops in Syria, as one example, is in part driven by this logic of threat construction. How many of us in the room have heard these questions, what will happen when we leave, what will prevent ISIS from returning, and so on. We've been asking these questions for 2 decades now, and in doing so, I think we're preventing ourselves from really taking seriously how our language and our construction of threats produces these things that many of us are appalled by and stunned by. The larger point that I want to make here is that the new forms of warfare that are emerging in the region and the entanglements are connected to certain narratives of threat, particularly narratives that produce the region as a space that is constantly producing insecurity. So whether it's ISIS or Al-Qaeda or refugees or so on. So what makes possible forms of warfare are forms of narrative, or stories that we tell about the region. So what do these two patterns mean for people in the region? As the forum has detailed, last year's figure was $25.5 billion in arms sales to the region, half of which went to Morocco, which I thought was very interesting. But these military sales and these figures, as Jody pointed out, they produce further violence against populations from their own governments. They militarize their states, they divert resources from state budgets, and they deepen the dependencies on rulers on the United States. But I think Jody's point is actually the really important one, that it becomes, what these sales essentially do is prop up governments that are creating space between them and their populations. They are not responsive, as we see, their response to democratic demands are to enact violence and so on. And in that sense, I think that we are implicated in the violent repression of democratic demands in the region. The human toll, the human toll of post-2001 American-led invasions and occupations in the region has been staggering. And of course, to some degree, it's beyond quantification. But what we do know is that people in the region are living in overlapping contexts of violence and insecurity, whether from their own governments, the United States, non-US military forces, or the combination of the three. These contexts are producing unbearable conditions of life for many people. Consider, for example, what life may be like for a Syrian from the northwest of the country who could have conceivably suffered violence, sieges, blockades from both the Syrian regime and rebel groups, actual bombardment from Russian airplanes, who is then forced to leave their homes and live under the governance of humanitarian workers. the overlapping subjugations that this hypothetical person experiences are compounded by contemporary U.S. policy in the region. To me, U.S. policy is not enacted independently of what's happening on the ground, and it's precisely this relationality of policy. Like, I don't want to say that the United States can dictate everything, and I don't want to say that it's independent of other actors. The last point that I want to make is actually, I hope, a simple one. What the current moment needs is politics. When we see that there's a surrender deal essentially offered to Palestinians, this deal to bring about Middle East peace, how I read that situation is that politics is no longer on offer, that we're not taking seriously the possibility of negotiation or deliberation. And while politics are being undermined, while the possibility of negotiation is being undermined, we see this militarized response to everything is constantly being reproduced. And I think for many people in the region, there has to be a way to kind of unravel these entanglements and make politics possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Omar.
Great. Well, thank you, Linda, Samir, Jody, and special thanks to Jeff and the forum for hosting us and the Stimson Center as well. I want to say it's really great to be here, but the topics that we're talking about are so difficult that I think it's great that we have an occasion to discuss them together and to think through what's happening. And particularly as we read the news of perhaps 900,000 people displaced in Idlib in the north of Syria, as a human being, as a parent, as anyone with sense of empathy, it's difficult to just look at these images and see what's happening and not feel devastated by these processes. But I think part of what I wanted to talk about today is, part of the reason for us to have this, joint panel with the forum is to talk a little bit about an initiative that some colleagues and I in the US and abroad are launching. We're calling it Security in Context. And we chose the word security in context precisely because when images and when news items like what's happening in northern Syria come up on the news, or anything that's foreign policy related, that is security related, as scholars of the region, as people who have traveled and invested and studied the region, we feel they're always or often missing a context. And we would like to try and present some of that context and bring some of that context to the US. And when I say context, I mean that in at least two ways. One is that when we often discuss issues like the Syrian conflict, like the so-called Sunni-Shia divide, like the war in Yemen, they're presented as snapshots, as if they're fixed in time, static, unchanging. We have a very cross-sectional view of it that's partial, and that doesn't incorporate the much wider web of relationships, of histories, of political economies, social, cultural, economic interrelationships that came to produce this particular outcome. And the second way is the transnational connections, is the connections with over here and over there. Often when we think of conflicts, we think of them as having over there. Even when we allow some of that path dependency and talk about that, yes, there is a history to this particular conflict, we talk about it as if it's an isolated island that has its own logic and its own path that is really not related to actions that we and others are undertaking in the region. And in many ways, often the pursuit of security in the US and elsewhere is the source of insecurity for many people in the region. So we'd like to present in this initiative, Security in Context, we'd like to present the perspective of security and insecurity from those in the region. And part of the way we're doing it is through partnerships with regional organizations that are invested and on the ground and connected to the wider webs of human rights organizations, activists, social movements, and try to together think about some of these changes that are happening and bring some of those perspectives to the US. And I'd like to talk a little bit about a new report that's coming with one of those partner organizations called the Syrian Center for Policy Research. It's an organization based in Damascus in Lebanon that's undertaken quite extensive research on the socioeconomic impact of the conflict in Syria. And I just co-authored a paper with them called Conflict Economies in Syria, Conflicts, Dynamics, and Pathways for Change. And the paper and the process emanated really from consultations among a wide number of Syria and Syrian experts in particular from various perspectives. And when we started giving the topic, we're interested in pursuing conflict economies, one of the things that struck me was the way that there was an insistence by many of these experts that the notion of conflict economy be presented in its totality. And what I mean by the totality is that there's a much wider web of relationships and transnational connections that go into a conflict economy and what constitutes a conflict economy, rather than oftentimes what comes to mind are narrow supply chains or narrow smuggling of goods from one place to another inside a war. And so one of the ways we can perhaps reframe the debate about the Syrian conflict that perhaps ties some of these different pieces of the puzzle in terms of the arms sales to different actors in the region and some of the issues that Samir touched upon is to look at this wider web of relationships. And I think one of the ways to think about the Syrian conflict in particular is to look at the militarized landscape in the region that the Syrian conflict started in 2011. We had a militarized conflict because not just of arms sales, which some of the things that Jody talks about in her report have a much longer history. They go back in the 1980s when the region was importing 1/3 of total arms imports in the world were going to the Middle East. The 1990s, post-Cold War period, when many regions around the world were cutting back on military expenditures. There was a cutback slightly in the region for a brief period of time, but it still remained one of the highest spenders in terms of its percentage allocating to arms expenditures as a percentage of its GDP relative to all regions in the world. And this is something that's reoccurring in this past decade. And in many of these cases, the US is the primary or one of the main sellers of weapons, 50% perhaps or more. But that's one aspect of the militarized landscape. Another aspect of that landscape was of course, the devastation that followed the war in Iraq and the exacerbation of sectarian identities, the militarization and the increasing instrumentalization by sectarian entrepreneurs of identities in order to gain power. And in turn, these became seen as sort of causal outcomes of conflict. So Sunni-Shia divide and other grievances within the region. Of course, there's the aspect of economic precarity and economic inequality. And we've had in the 1990s aggressive pursuit by the US and European Union and multinational institutions of neoliberal economic policies that had mixed outcomes at best, but saw the states withdraw from social expenditures in many of these states, increasing economic inequality, increasing corruption and capture and alliances between the holders of power and the holders of wealth in those countries. So you had a very fragile, militarized, unequal landscape. And when the Syrian uprising started, it was really part of the wider Arab uprisings of an expression by Syrian society against an extremely authoritarian government, which was an outlier even among authoritarian governments in terms of its centralization of power, in terms of the impunity of its security sector. But that initial layer of the uprising quickly became entangled with multiple other layers, which caused the violence to be exacerbated substantially. And once violence was introduced, as a scholar of conflict, Susan Woodward, said, violence makes your choices for you. You don't choose violence, violence chooses you. And what she means by that is that when violence starts, like in a civil war situation, people have to seek shelter. People have to often cling to or mobilize identities that may not be necessarily mobilized before that. And one most obvious example is what I just said about the so-called sectarian divides, Sunni-Shia divides, Alawite-Sunni divides in the case of Syria. And so the second layer of that was that the Syrian conflict, as many of you know, quickly became an arena for what was previously a Cold War between Iran on the one hand and pro-Western governments such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the Emirates, and Turkey to be a battleground. This Cold War was picking up in momentum in the lead up to the uprising, and Syria was seen as the weak link in the so-called resistance axis, which included Iran, which included Hezbollah. Prior to the conflict, they were trying to peel Syria off from this axis through economic investments. So there were significant investments by Turkey, by Qatar, and the other countries to try and pull Syria out. After the conflict started, Syria became a battleground, and there was this inflow of fighters and weapons and financing of the war by these countries in order to draw Iran and Syria into this quagmire and try to defeat them in the country. But that's just the second level. What makes and made things even more complicated were the splits within the pro-Western camp. And so you quickly saw that Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, on one hand, were opposed to the goals of Qatar and Turkey on the other in Syria. For various reasons, Qatar and Turkey, the groups that they supported, were seen by Saudi Arabia and Emirates as too supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood that they have traditionally been in opposition to. So they opposed them in Egypt, and they were supportive of the coup that led to the overthrow of Morsi, and they wanted to oppose them in Syria. And so, in addition to the confrontation between pro-Western and, I suppose, anti-Western forces, you saw the divides, which had an influence on the Syrian opposition. It fragmented, it contributed to the fragmentation of the Syrian opposition at the political level in terms of the Syrian National Coalition, which had formed and taken hold in Turkey. And it also contributed to different factions fighting each other. And this is among the so-called Sunni states. So in our analysis, or in the analysis that sometimes takes sectarianism as this primordial, eternal conflict that is causing all these wars, this can't be explained. This is intra-Sunni conflicts. And it's a major aspect of the story. Of course, we also had the formation of ISIS. So another layer of this was the formation of the Islamic State. And in many ways, the formation of the Islamic State was both a catalyst as well as a reason for the intervention of international forces, particularly the US and Russia as well. And that's a further layer of what's happening in Syria. The US itself currently has presence of US forces in the east of the Mediterranean, east of the Euphrates. And when we think about the role of the US, we have to think about the entire legacy of US responses to the conflict in Syria. Often the conflict is, the US role in the conflict is pitched as the role of the bad Samaritan, that the US in Syria essentially saw a conflict, it turned the other way, it didn't intervene forcefully enough. But if we look at the totality of the CIA program, which was roughly of around $1 billion, $500 million Pentagon program for the training of rebels in Jordan and in Turkey, and we look at the signals that the US involvement sent to the regional countries, in many ways it exacerbated the conflict. The conflict in Syria was perpetuated because there was too much external intervention, not sufficient external intervention. And now we see, if we look at the role of the sanctions, which is this shift from direct warfare to economic warfare, it's often viewed as, is it working in terms of undermining the government? Is it going to cause the reform of the Syrian government? But one of the things that's not talked about is the way it's fragmenting the country. Everything, we say that Syria is under sanctions, but in fact, half of Syria is under sanctions, or was under sanctions. That is, west of the Euphrates was under sanctions, but east of the Euphrates was having investments in terms of local development by the US. These punishing half the country and investing in half the country, aside from the humanitarian impact of the sanctions itself, is, I think, a recipe for fragmentation and division of the country, and that's something that in the long run is a recipe for even more conflict. I think I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I've been taking some notes, and the one dominating thought that keeps running through my mind is how wonderful this panel would have been when I was teaching undergraduates international relations theory in the early 2000s, and they kept asking, why do they hate us so much? Because there's exactly this kind of perspective is missing in so many American classrooms and at high levels of government. I think it won't have escaped notice for this audience that foreign policy matters are a very minor part of the conversation happening in the presidential race. And certainly nothing that even begins to touch to the level of what we're talking about here, despite how clearly relevant it would be. I have a couple of questions I want to shoot across your bow, take a few minutes to have a lightning round response, and then open it up to the audience. One of my questions, probably mostly to Jody, but anyone can feel free to step in on this, is it's clear that, you mentioned some of the laws we have that are quite good. They're not bad laws. We just don't actually enforce them, either through lack of awareness or desire not to enforce them. This is also something that our report on proxy war really teases out, all the legal structures and frameworks and what is working and what's not working. The much bigger question is, how do you shift the incentive structure, right? Why are they, what's going on? Why is it so easy to disregard these frameworks that were put in place for very good reason? And what could we do to shift the incentive structure that allows them to be disregarded? Another question I have is, how do we break this cycle of creating messes that then we clean? Right? Clearly, there is this perpetual war, right? I think even those of us who aren't well versed in the politics of the Middle East or even foreign policy understand that there is something different about the way war is happening in the 21st century, and it doesn't sound like World War II anymore. And so, how do you interrupt that cycle? And related to that is, all of the panelists have mentioned the ways in which the U.S. bears a great deal of responsibility that it very rarely shoulders or acknowledges. What is the responsible move now? Where we are today, with the deeply complex and problematic and violent history of U.S. foreign policy in the region, what is the responsible move now? It doesn't quite feel right to just be isolationist, although perhaps that's responsible, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. So let's just go, right back across the line of panelists and hear your quick thoughts. And you don't have to give a complete answer at this point if you don't want to, but quick thoughts on those questions, and then we'll open it up. Thanks. I want to start with Jody.
Small questions like that. Thank you. Just solve Mina.
Yeah, exactly.
I think starting with the incentive structures, a couple areas that are going to be important. One is, strangely enough, part of it in the U.S. will relate to things like campaign finance, which is probably not what you're expecting to hear. This is not to take any side in any political party running for office, but it is a theme that you will hear quite a bit, because a lot of issues, as we look at it, do relate not only to the willingness of industry to pay to get that influence with the executive and legislative branch. But frankly, the legislative and executive branch also have, our report was called a mutual extortion racket for a reason, because the executive branch and the legislative branch also have a lot of pull and sway over what ends up happening with defense industry and exports and so forth. Exports, depending on, when we look at some of the data, there's a lot of small companies, there's subs and stuff that depend on exports, but a lot of the really big exports is really linking to the top 5 to 10 big U.S. defense companies. But there's a push-pull for both of them. It's not just a one-way street. It has to be remembered. These are companies that overall, when you look at the fact that where their money comes from directly or where the permissions and licensing they need, easily 90% of what their profit margin can be is somehow linked to the U.S. government. So that also gives the U.S. government a tremendous amount of pull over them that I think a lot of times is not looked at. And so it's not just a one-way streak. It's the two sides pulling on each other, and that ends up leading to, I think, a lot of issues of campaign finance. But I think also just a lot of getting back into academia and what we do and having taught at the National Defense University, really trying to better understand conflict, and there's so much that has changed on conflict and so forth, that frankly I don't think a lot of times has made it into certainly our military corps. I'm less familiar, but also it seems often with our diplomatic corps and others out there. Having taught at National Defense University, having looked at U.S. military doctrine, for example, counterinsurgency doctrine for all of its problems, and there's tons, is all of a grievance-based theory, that if you win the hearts and minds, everybody will be happy. That was very prevalent in the 70s and 80s, and it's still part of how we understand conflict, but it's only one part of how we understand the larger conflict. I often use the example, which is becoming, I guess, more relevant in the last week or so in Afghanistan, that if in theory, if we solve every single grievance that those who claim to support the Taliban have, would Afghanistan be a peaceful country? I guess we're going to find out. I presume the answer is going to be no, because there's so many other conflict dynamics of, everything from ideology to financing to the role of organized crime, the role of warlords and so forth, that clearly there's something very wrong with the grievance-based doctrine. So I do think a lot of it comes with education and putting in the political structures and so forth that allow for it. A lot of sometimes I think what we take is like an intense desire to do bad is sometimes really truly ignorance on part. Sometimes it is just groups who are happy to make a profit off of a war or whatever. That certainly, it's not that it doesn't exist, but I don't think that's always the instant you can chalk it up to all the time. That there's plenty of room for ignorance and mistakes and everything else. I think I'll stop there.
Thanks. Sumner, you want to
Sure.
take a crack at it?
It's interesting to think of what happened to the energy of the anti-war movement in 2002, 2003, because I'm not sure what its legacies are here in the United States. So I'm going to just kind of focus my comment on the United States. Everybody in this room knows that what we were sold in the invasion of Iraq, there's been a clear distinction by many politicians, including President Obama, wars of choice and all these things. And yet there's no sustained anti-war movement that I think would be applying political pressure to do some of the things that Jodi's suggesting that are absent, or to apply the pressure to ensure that we're not selling arms, or as many arms, to these ENF countries. Interestingly, in Canada, there was controversy recently with the decision to sell tanks to Saudi Arabia. And there was there were protests, there was immense public pressure against the government. This is Trudeau, he's supposed to be very liberal, and everything is about human rights and whatever, and yet the deal still went through. And so that's an example, I think, of a failure of when political pressure cannot prevent these things. But I think ultimately, where we are all standing in the world, that's sort of what's needed, in a way, is to revive the energy of that movement, or that period, and to highlight these things, and to make some of the things that Jodi's talking about to be public knowledge, and to remind ourselves of what the consequences, not just on people in the region, of course that's what we're thinking about today, but also on our own economy and our own structure of our society, and the implications on that.
Thanks.
Picking up on the question of public and education, and I think obviously it's not going to be one thing, it's going to be a series of issues, but I've been thinking of the two big international policy debates over the past decade. One about the crisis of the climate, crisis of extinction and the climate change, and the other is about economic crisis, inequalities, economic precarity. And think about how questions about military spending and the military in general are completely isolated in our national policy debates. And I think it's time to link those together a little bit more. What is the ecological footprint of the U.S. military, of these wars that have devastated the ecologies of those societies, like in Iraq, for example, and continue to devastate them, and other countries that have had wars, from Vietnam until today, that still suffer environmental impacts of bombings. And our colleagues at the Cost of War Project, looking at, for many people who are concerned about jobs, who are concerned about the economic impact of the military. What would happen if we started reallocating that spending, right? I mean, as an economist, I look at opportunity costs, right? What are the opportunity costs of economic spending on the military versus other types of spending, social spending on healthcare, education? And I think, starting to introduce that to the public, I think is important because many people actually, I think many of the students don't know the extent of military spending in the U.S. They don't even realize that, oh, it's really that much? I mean, and I think that has to be part of that, linking those different questions that I think oftentimes are not linked together might be one way to start thinking about it.
It's creative and interesting, actually. Okay, that leaves us plenty of time for a good discussion. We have a microphone that will be roving and capture your questions. Anybody have a comment or a question they'd like to make? Let's take these two together. Let us know who you are.
Yep. Elias Yusuf with the Security Assistance Monitor. Thank you so much for a great panel so far. Really appreciate it. I wanted to ask a quick question. Samir, you mentioned the sort of geographic footprint of the U.S. military. I'm wondering how you interpret the sort of diffusion of the U.S. military. Obviously, its physical presence has declined to some degree over the last decade from its peak of 200,000 over, in 2007 or whatever it may have been. But maybe the way that they're being deployed and sort of the use of special forces, how is that impacting this? Because the numbers are smaller, but obviously its militarization remains.
Yeah, let's take both questions.
Yeah, thanks. I'm Matt Harb. I'm with the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. I can't escape the political nature of this whole thing. I mean, if we're talking about the United States itself, I think last count is like 44 or 45 states within the United States benefit financially from the arms industry. Yes, it's true that companies are in control of all this, and they have lobbyists and they have politicians in their pockets, so to speak, and the Defense Department really cannot do very much about that. I wonder if you can just address the political nature of the issue of arms trade, and specifically because the United States is the first arms seller in the world. Thank you.
All right.
I'll take the second question.
Okay.
Throw you under the bus for the other one. I think you bring up a really interesting point on the domestic side, looking at the U.S. domestic side and politics on this. And again, coming from my background as former military, on the jobs argument, one is the need for good information. I think guys like William Hartung have done a wonderful job on pointing out and the cost of war project and stuff on actually how many jobs and stuff like that are defense related. And William's done some great work on like where the F-35 really is versus where does defense industry say they're building it, and how many states are actually only half a dozen jobbers or less, and so on. So one is we need good data. We've all heard about this illustrious heat map that supposedly at the Aerospace Industries Association that was bring around to every congressman that none of us has actually ever seen. That supposedly says how many jobs are in the district, et cetera. And having, as military work at the Pentagon, and whenever we wanted to close like a National Guard base, and how many letters we would get from 9 billion senators of how dare you close the base in our area. So those are all very, very real considerations. I think with the electorate, my feel is, and I haven't seen really good polling on this, unfortunately. This goes from talking with staffers and those who worked on election campaigns and stuff, is there's this weird dichotomy because, remember, part of the reason Trump got elected was because he went to rural states and he promised that the U.S. was going to be more isolationist and he was going to pull us out of places. The two areas where we do most of our recruiting for troops are urban areas, and then for urban lower class, and then rural areas. And there is a lot of rural areas where sons and daughters and nieces and nephews have missed 4 or 5 Thanksgivings in a row. These are where your casualties and your wounded and so forth are coming in. And so having a strong isolationist policy, if we're going to bring the troops back home, resonates in rural areas. I don't know if it's not quite maybe the platform that some of the parties necessarily running on, but I think there is potentially, and be interesting to see if there's polling, an undercurrent of how exhausted those key areas around bases and so forth, these key rural areas really are for being overseas and stuff so often, I think is underappreciated. At the same time, and often these are the same places where defense industry really matter, especially around bases are the same places that there's large defense industries often. And so, niece or nephew may be gone from home 5 Thanksgivings in a row, but aunt or uncle works in a defense factory, and they really need those jobs. And so this is going to be a really interesting dichotomy because it's often the same populations that have actually conflicting interests, and I don't think it's going to be that easy to pull apart.
Thank you, Elias, for that question. Ahmad, if you want to jump in as well. I'm going to give an inarticulate answer because I think there's an articulate answer to this, but there's a relationship for me between the technologies of warfare today and the geographies of war. And so when we hear stories about drone operators in the United States operating drones halfway across the world, that means that their geography is no longer a limit to how wars are fought. And I think that so if I'm thinking to the Obama administration debates about troop presence in Iraq, and there was, we're bringing troops back, and then you realize that the private military contract, the numbers of private military contractors are going up. And that is also, to me, a form of warfare. So I think that the saying, for example, there's only 1,500 US troops in Syria does not do justice to the actual US presence in Syria or the region, because these new technologies that are available stretch the footprint in a way. I will also say, there was an article a few months ago, I thought the title was silly, but I'm thinking it's not, The War of Drones, about what's happening in the Middle East. And now, what I'm reading a lot is there are drone attacks on places, and it's not actually clear who's using the drone. I mean, who is attacking? And maybe that's just because that's how they report these things. But Iran, we know, has drones. We know Hezbollah has drones. We know Russians. We know now I read something recently that maybe some of the armed groups in the Northwest that are affiliated with Turkey are operating drones. So all of these things fundamentally change warfare and make that number of, say, 1,500 troops here or there effectively meaningless.
Great, let's take another round. Gentleman at the back, and this woman here on the aisle.
Hi, my name is Brian Bowman. I'm a journalist with the Globe Post. My question is for anybody who wants to take it, but Summer had mentioned that there's a lack of public pressure and that there's not much of an active anti-war movement in the United States any longer. I'm wondering if you guys consider that to be a reflection of a media failure in reporting on matters of U.S. foreign policy. Somebody else had mentioned that it's not featured prominently during the presidential debates, and as somebody who's a journalist myself, I've written a lot of articles about like Yemen, for example, and it's generally my sense that I'm not sure most Americans are even aware that we're involved in a war in Yemen or know anything about it at all. So yeah, this is my question just about the media role in all this.
Thanks for the panel. It's a wonderful presentation. My name is Li Yang, and you do touch a lot of points from the historical and cultural education and election background. But my important things I want to focus accountability and reliability. Who should be responsible, and from the America point of view, you should know where the budget go, and whether you give it to somebody who have a better use for justice and fairness, rather than you go nowhere, just put into some for private profit purpose. And then just like in America, election is really meaningless because it's manipulated in such a way, good candidate cannot have a chance to speak. The media is controlled by those people who rob the government's money. So I just wonder if we can focus our election, really have a good election, people really go to vote and make an election meaningful rather than spend a lot of money and a lot of people report of polling is really meaningless. So I just wonder, what's the strategy that we have the legislature, the three branches, they have accountability, you know, how to penalize people who have a falsification and that really harm our society. So if we can just work together, concentration on the truthfulness and responsibility rather than for those people who harm our society. And when they harm our society, they make all kinds of excuses to blame other foreigners. And I don't think we should blame on other foreigners unless we have accountability. So I just wonder if you can work something to improve the media, to improve the three branches of office. So that's the way we have to work. Otherwise, it just go in a circle, just nowhere to improve it. Thank you.
Thank you. Not unrelated questions, actually, but really, really good one on the media. I'd like to hear your thoughts.
So to start, I mean, I think that's a good question. It's not just about media reporting about the impact of these wars abroad. It's about the impact of these militarization internally as well. Talking about the rural kids in the Midwest or elsewhere, you know, what is happening to these families as a consequence of these, you know, endless wars like in Afghanistan. No longer visible. It's sinking. Okay. So the best parts of my comments, you missed them. But I think you heard them. So I think we need more and better coverage, and the way to do that is to make more research and more knowledge production about these issues visible so that the media can't ignore it. I don't think we're going to be able to reform the media. I mean, I hope not. That's the only path to do it. I think the reality is that as someone who follows the Middle East, I came to the U.S. in 1996. Since then, I would say that there's a lot more diversity and critical voices in the media about the Middle East since the time that I came to the U.S. And a lot of that has been through education, through social movements, through activism, through experts trying to present different perspectives. So there is progress within the school me landscape. But tying back to the previous questions, I think also a lot of the framing of these issues, especially now under Trump, the instinctive opposition to what Trump might propose, rather than we think ourselves, what is the best outcome? You know, think about what is possible now. And I think back about the debate, which I found a little bit bizarre when there was the proposal for withdrawing troops from Syria, where there was an instinctive reaction that because Trump was proposing it, it has to be bad, which it might be the case. But rather thinking about, okay, what is the sound and logical long-term policy here? And, you know, I heard a lot of things about, you know, the U.S. leaving Syria and ceding it to Iran or ceding it to another country. Syria was never a U.S. ally, was never in the U.S. orbit. I mean, even Iran at some point had close relationships with the U.S. Syria was never. Its foundational politics was nationalist and sort of anti-imperialist, anti-Western, and so on. So I think we also need to think about how these debates are framed in the media. And, you know, the question of politics is always coming up, but I think we need third parties. We need independent voices that are not partisan necessarily, that instrumentalize each moment of crisis politically, because that short-termist logic is not helpful for us to think about sound policy, I think.
Brian, that's a great question, Brian. And I have a former student in the room, so I don't want to speak for my students. But as a university professor and seeing the experience of my students from the financial crisis to now, I feel that a lot of young people who we would assume would be part of the drive, the part of the drivers of this movement, legitimately have other things on their mind. And I think that Ahmad alluded to some of the other debates that we're having, and I think that's actually one of the best, that we do not treat militarism and the effects of militarism on our society as something that we need to be debating publicly. Because then we get into this, you hate the troops, you hate the, this, like, all these things that are unproductive and meant to shut down debate, but I think that we really need to take seriously the effects of what we do over there, which is how we talk about it, with what happens here in our country. And until there is a kind of radical shift, not just in the media, because I don't think the problem is necessarily information. Like, I think that it's not a conspiracy that the justifications for the Iraq war were false. That's not everybody here knows that. It's not, because there has been good reporting, but we understand these things that are happening. We have some knowledge about them, but what we need to be doing is framing them in terms of big debates that affect us, not just now, but in future generations.
I'd like to jump on that and point out that, you sort of hint at this point, which is it's not only knowledge and awareness that makes accountability. There are plenty of people who understand all of the flaws of foreign policy making, and there are voices, and they are aware, and they do speak, but it is, there's a bit of a machine about how foreign policy is made, and it doesn't listen. And one of the things that makes it listen the most is every 4 years when there's a presidential election. But that goes to your question about who makes American voters accountable. How do we get them to take responsibility for what their government does when it's always all about them and their hometowns and what they're experiencing very close to home? But the impact of U.S. activity is felt all over the world. The other thing I just want to throw out there is we all know this, but we've been speaking as if it's uniform. U.S. foreign policy is 1,000 things, made in 1,000 rooms and places across the city and the country. And so we all know that, and it competes with itself. There is, the bureau desk foreign policy, the diplomacy, the DC foreign policy, the embassy post foreign policy, the military foreign policy, the different parts of DoD, the intelligence community. You can sit here and name 1,000 different points where foreign policy is made and influenced. And that means that all the knowledge that we can bring together in this room and elsewhere around the city still has an uphill battle to fight to swing the incentives of all those different centers of power to making responsible foreign policy. So I think I just made everything a little grimmer and muddier. I don't think I helped anything, but I just wanted to raise that point, which we kind of know. Another round of questions.
To make it
please.
even more grimmer
Yeah.
and muddier, perhaps, is some of the things alluded to in Jodi's report.
Yeah.
Is that many of the countries, small or medium-sized countries, are now asserting their own agency and power and projecting it beyond their borders and into the U.S. in
Yeah.
the form of lobbying.
Yeah.
In all sorts of ways, some of which are legal and some of which may be illegal. And so I think that opens up a new avenue for thinking that it's not simply these companies lobbying for this, but it's also different governments who want this to continue.
And the bots and the things that happen online and in virtual space and 1,000 other ways in which the world is a really grim place. All right, anybody have some? Okay, we do. We have another round of questions. So Andreas, and then behind him, and across. Let's take 3 questions this time because we're getting close to the end.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. To Samir, and because you just introduced yourself as a university professor, let me push you on this. And it follows up from the grim story. You focus very much on threat constructions, on narratives that sort of seem to, in your way, to constrain our way of imagination, and that we need new constructions, new narratives to find other ways to deal with this issue. I'm delighted to see that critical security studies is alive and well at Villanova, that we have a little bit of securitization theory thrown in this, that's absolutely wonderful. I look at this photo and I'm going to push you on the methodology of this particular approach. which to me seems to be solipsistic and monological, right? Simply because we can imagine the world differently doesn't mean that it will be different. I see I guess the Syrian flag, that is the one of the Assad regime. I see the United States flag, and I see 3 Russian flags there. If this is supposed to be Syria, then I throw in, for good measure, the militias that roam around there. I throw in the mercenaries, the Wagner group. I throw in all sorts of smaller countries that assert their agency. We have pardon the language, a Fustercluck over there with all sorts of narratives, all sorts of threat constructions. The US has lost, if you will, the hegemony to determine what the narrative here is about. So this is not only difficult to know, this is an unknowable situation. So where do you then take it from there in terms of your analysis of the processes that should lead to a different kind of policy? For instance, exactly, even more fun to throw around. So it's nice to be sort of, sitting in your armchair as a critical security studies expert. The world is perhaps a little bit less amenable to this kind of stuff.
Yes.
As a provocation.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Andreas Benke, University of Reading. Having dabbled myself in critical security studies for much too long.
Hi, I'm Tara Siegel, and among other things, I'm an organizer with If Not Now, which is a movement of young American Jews seeking to end our community support for the Israeli military occupation. And I wanted to offer a quick comment and a question. The quick comment is that I very much agree that foreign policy has not played a major role in the presidential debates and discussion. But we have seen pretty major changes when it comes to Israel and Palestine, in that 4 years ago, the Democratic Party platform refused to even include the word occupation to describe what was going on in Israel and Palestine. And at this stage, most of the leading Democrats have outright condemned occupation, and in fact considered the possibility of imposing human rights conditions on the military aid that we give to Israel. And my question is, I guess, if movements like mine succeed in rallying popular opinion around placing human rights conditions on our military aid packages and our arms trades, what are the key impediments that will remain to getting this job done?
Hard Middle East tie, no relation to Imad, but I consider him a friend. So to follow up on Tara's question about the presidential debate, I do agree that foreign policy has not played a major role, but whenever it has come up, we have heard some radical ideas outside of the mainstream from now front runners. Bernie Sanders talking about the global arms industry, not only in the United States, and how we can shift that money to combat climate change. Senator Warren's talking about withdrawing all combat troops from the Middle East. Even Vice President Joe Biden, a centrist, is talking about ending U.S. support to the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. And these are not a Kucinich or a Ron Paul. These are front runners for a major party. Do you see these proposals as realistic despite the seriousness of the people who are voicing them?
Good stuff. Jump in as you feel moved.
I'll start on the accountability one, since that was, I'm not taking a side on any of the issues. I mean, the weaknesses we've seen in conditionality of U.S. security assistance and U.S. arms exports have been well written up by the Government Accountability Office and others. One is that just the controls on those are relatively weak, and the groups that are supposed to do it in the State Department, Commerce Department, so forth, are often undermanned. GAO has done a good job at noting, they tried to do I can't remember what year it was now. For example, tried to go into Egypt and find out where a lot of our arms exports had gone and actually go through and document where they were at. And Egypt just wouldn't let them in, and arms exports continued. I mean, this is the problem with conditionality on anything, whether it be arms export or anything. If you're not going to follow through with it and you're not going to check, then it's not very useful conditionality. And if there's no ramifications for it, it's not useful conditionality. And so, going back to requiring checks on those things, making sure that those who check that stuff are well staffed and well trained and actually do it, and that things get turned off when things don't work. Is well acknowledged in the conditionality, issues of literature on conditionality, whether we're talking about fiscal conditionality or IMF conditionality programs or defense ones or whatever. This is the same across the board. On the overall, and again, I don't take sides on anything coming out. There's just a lot. I think it is refreshing compared to the last time to actually see a debate on foreign policy. I do think the fact that there was only a few lines given to Iraq or Afghanistan or anything in 2016 as former military member was incredibly shocking to me. So I am glad to see at least a discussion of it. Whether I agree with the discussion or not is a very different issue, but I am happy to see at least now that there is a discussion. I tend to take a lens that all politics is local, and until the particular politics really speaks to local people and can get above the issues of picking up kids from daycare and how you're going to make the mortgage and I need to get my driver's license renewed and everything else, until those things are really visceral to you, it's really hard to get voters to focus on that. The fact that you could go through 2016 with almost no discussion of foreign policy is because the voters, no one was screaming at them, where is your Afghanistan policy and why aren't you guys talking about that? And no one was yelling at the moderators in their debate. How come you guys didn't ask any foreign policy questions? I really think that, from a media perspective, you have to make it resonate to your average person, your average voter. And going back to my statement before, I was former military, but Jesus, that's like a 10, 12-hour a day job. Those are 60-hour weeks. Even when I was deploying to Iraq, I usually didn't know the specifics of U.S. foreign policy in Iraq because I was way too busy packing my bags for Iraq to follow the minutiae of reading foreign affairs articles and foreign policy articles. And Lord knows I'm not pulling up a .gov website or anything. I think we do have to be realistic of how much people can rationally process in their day with everything else going on. And I think, if you're going to report on Yemen, and there are people who have the bandwidth, university students are notorious for it, for having the bandwidth to follow that stuff, I think that's great. But unless you can make that speak more to normal citizens, I think that's going to be tough. One of the best articles I started to see, and that didn't go very far, I guess, was talk about where do the bombs produced for Yemen, like in what states and what factories. So it starts becoming, a local person in Pennsylvania versus, well, somewhere over there in Yemen. Because I think also in the problem, and this goes that dichotomy of voters of, people who work in defense plants and stuff. It just kind of gets shipped. For a long time, we shipped stuff to Saudi Arabia that we knew they didn't need and couldn't absorb. They were buying our loyalty. There's a lot of reasons you buy arms, and national security is often not the primary one. One of them was, the Saudi regime wanted to stay in power, and they would buy a lot of our stuff so that we would be nice to them, and they would let us base so we would be nice to them. And they weren't ever supposed to use the stuff. And lo and behold, they go into Yemen and they start using the stuff. And, no one ever said, well, what happens if they ever decide to use all those pay-away bombs and all those aircraft and everything that they bought? Those were supposed to be just for flying around and looking cool. They were really scary to fly with, by the way. I didn't have to do it. My pilots had to do it. And, they were always, breaking all sorts of rules in the air and stuff like that. That got scary. But, it was for fun. They weren't supposed to use the stuff. So I think you have to make it more local, and you have to, really, people have to push their politicians to say, explain to me, why this stuff is going through. But it's got to resonate with regular citizens. There's just so much other stuff going on.
Thank you, Andres, for your comment. So I'm not going to give a satisfactory answer, I think, in part because I think that the project of critical security studies to identify the way in which threat is constructed and acted upon does not then take us to the alternative world. And I think that the criticism that you're rendering is very fair to me, in the sense that when I was a graduate student and my friends would come over and we would talk, my dad would always yell at us, "Did you solve Palestine yet?" And in a way it's that we can propose alternatives for reimagining threat. We can talk, but the reality is that the materiality of power in the region now renders a reordering of threat very difficult, very challenging. And pardon? No, I actually think it's a very fair point that that the expression of power and what you were describing here, these vehicles, I mean, this is the realization of that threat, and I think that in many ways that's much more important. That it's my debates I have with my students about knowledge as power. I say, well, tell that to a gun, or tell that to this, or whatever. And so I think that there are limitations. That said, I think Tara, I don't know if that was that kind of saved me in a way. I think Tara's question and point is a good example of how over time we can think about the reorientation of threat, in the sense that when I was a university student and we used to say Israeli occupation, we were almost beaten off of campus. And now the language that people use, the way in which they speak about the relationship between the United States and Israel is radically different. So I think that holds out more hope for the reorienting of our worldview than critical security studies scholars coming up with new ways of imagining threat.
I mean, and unfortunately, this is not, I mean, it's all too real for us, the consequences of these, as people from the region. And we could go into a lot, actually, and trace the history of how did these different flags end up being there, and why is Russia there to begin with. But that will take us for the next few hours. And I tried to hint, or a few hours, you know, and years maybe. But, I mean, I applaud your efforts, and I think, you know, sort of to round out some of this discussion that we've been having in terms of thinking of alternatives. I mean, in particular, the Palestinian situation is particularly bleak. There was just an article this morning that was published on Jabalia about the isolation that the Palestinians feel, not just from or as a result of Trump administration policies. Even those donors who provide them with aid have conditionalities that essentially force them to end their resistance towards Israel as a condition for those aid. So even those who are supporting them are in fact imposing conditions on them. But more broadly in the region, I mean, I think one of the bright points is the reemergence of popular movements and protest movements that we've seen, not just in Palestine, of course, which is ongoing, but in Lebanon and Iraq, the Sudan and Algeria and elsewhere. And I think, you know, we should listen to them. I mean, movements here, they feel very isolated. We should listen to them and support them because they are saying quite a bit about many of the issues we've been discussing, especially in the movement in Iraq, which was refusing all sorts of external intervention, all regional actors, Iran and Saudi Arabia and the United States. They were formulating critiques of economic policies, like in the case of Lebanon, towards austerity policies and basically the ruling oligarchy. So I think there's quite a bit there in terms of connections. There's quite a bit of really, despite the gloom and doom that's happening in the region, a resurgence of an attempt to reassert popular sovereignty in those regions. And I think that's a bright spot that should be supported.
I am delighted to end on a bright spot. Join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you, Linda.
Thank you.
Thank you.